So I don't have to tell you that China is a rising power, and I certainly don't have to tell you it's probably the world's most important rising power. There are other rising powers, India, the other BRIC, so-called BRICS, but amongst these, China is the most important rising power. And by many measures, it is today the world's second leading power after the United States. You can measure this by a number of ways. The aggregate economy of China is about to surpass by the American aggregate GDP sometime around 2020 or 2025, depending on the estimates that you read. And over the last 2 decades, China has moved from the periphery of the international system to the center of the international system. And we read about China every day, everywhere, in our newspapers, in our multimedia, in our social media. China's out there in the planet, gobbling up resources, soaking up resources, certainly absorbing foreign investment from abroad, but more recently is now beginning to export foreign investment abroad in a rather significant way. I just saw the figures last 2 days ago. For 2012, China's foreign non-financial ODI, they call it, overseas direct investment, is $77 billion last year, and expanding rather rapidly, particularly in Europe, and particularly even in the United States and Latin America. So that's a kind of new phenomenon. And China's expanding its overseas footprints in many different areas, many different ways. And that's what this book is about. It tries to, as Yoshi suggested by telling you what the chapters are, it tries to evaluate and identify what China is doing out there in the world. And it's doing quite a lot. Its impact is increasingly being felt really all across the planet, and indeed off the planet. In space, China has the world's most kind of assertive space program today. The Americans are contracting, the Russians are contracting, the Chinese are going to the moon within the next 10 years. So in many different areas, China is making itself felt out there in international relations. But the story of China's rise is not a new one. It's been discussed a great deal in the international relations literature really for 20 years. I looked in my office just a couple days ago before I left Washington to come here to Japan, and I noticed there were almost 20 books on my shelf with the term rise about China in the title. China rising, China has risen, the impacts of China rise. So the whole subject of China's rise is not new. And it's been the subject of many, many different studies, some of them with very sort of fanciful titles. There was a book published 2 years ago, you may have heard of, by a British writer named Martin Jacques, entitled When China Rules the World. The Rise of the Middle Kingdom and the End of the Western World. Quite a shocking title. I think he sold a lot of books just based on the title. Another book by James King from the Financial Times, entitled China Shakes the World. There have been other similar kind of provocative titles. Last year one came out in Washington called Eclipse, Living in the Shadow of China's Dominance. And another book that had the title Death by China. So a lot of these are very provocative titles, and written not by scholars. Some of them are written by journalists or observers of different types. So one way or another, though, all this writing about China raises the specter of a dramatic transformation in world affairs as a result of China's ascent, China's rise. In the United States, interesting. Most of the writing about China's rise isn't so much about world affairs, it's about the impact of China's rise on the United States and on the American so-called primacy in the world, and certainly in the Asia-Pacific region. So in the American writing about China, there's a very kind of almost bilateral or focus. The Americans don't really care what China's doing in Africa or Latin America or in space. They care what China's rise means for America. It's a very kind of narrow focus. And many of the books that have been written by American scholars take a kind of very careful look at the rising China again and its impact on an established American power, such as Aaron Friedberg's book. Aaron Friedberg is a professor at Princeton University, published a very significant book last year called The Contest for Supremacy. Think about it, the contest for supremacy. China, America, and the struggle for the mastery of Asia. And that just tells you everything. That's how most American realists, scholars, but I would say many American academics, many American journalists, many American government policymakers think about China. What is China's rise going to mean for American primacy? This is a kind of zero-sum competition for preeminence. That's how most Americans tend to define the subject of China's rise. So there's no shortage of writings on this subject, is the point. Now, when I started off 6 years ago on this project, after I completed my book on the Chinese Communist Party, which I see you have a copy of. I remember 4 years ago I was in this room giving a talk about that book. That book, of course, is about domestic Chinese affairs and the Chinese Communist Party. But after I finished that, I decided to tackle this question of China's rise and try and write my own assessment of this. But I wanted to do it differently from the other previous studies. I wasn't so much interested in the rise of China vertically, so much as the spread of China horizontally. It wasn't, to me, I'm interested in the impact of China's rise on the United States, and on Sino-American relations, and on American primacy. Yes, that does interest me, but I'm more interested, as a China scholar, in what China's doing in various dimensions out there in the world, and so I wanted to examine what these activities are, what China's presence is, on a truly global basis and across a whole range of indicators, as closely and get as close as I could to the totality of China's global presence. That was my sort of first goal. And the second goal was to look beyond diplomacy. I did not want to write a book about Chinese foreign policy. There's a lot of those. I've written them myself. Yoshi's contributed to them. There are many books on Chinese diplomacy, but I would, in my own thinking and my own teaching, I distinguish between foreign policy and foreign relations. Many scholars use those terms interchangeably, but I don't think they're the same thing. Foreign policy is something that comes from a government. Foreign relations is something that comes from a society with other foreign societies. So it's a much more diverse set of interactions between one country and other countries. Foreign policy is a declaratory set of policies that a government makes about its relations with the world. So I was much more interested in this book to get at foreign relations than just foreign policy. And when I started